Hello makers, and welcome to Share Stitchery. I'm Catherine Harris, and if you're new here, I do sewing and DIY tutorials each week, so smash that subscribe button down below. This week, I wanted to share with you the needle case that I made for circular knitting needles. Erica Made Designs actually has a tutorial on how she made hers. I will link that down below, but I modified it just enough that I thought it warranted a tutorial all on its own because I did decorate the front a little bit and it is in a very specific design, and you will find out later why I chose the things I did. But I do a little bit of English paper piecing as well as some hand applique that I think you might be interested in checking out. So let's get to that tutorial.
Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum.
So we're going to start with the back zip pocket. And so we're going to take the front of the zipper and we're going to lay the zipper face down or right sides together on the front zipper, and then place the lining on top of that, right sides together. Now all the measurements for all of this will be in Erica's pattern that you can purchase. I'll leave a link down below, and alternatively in her video. I just didn't want to give any of that away. So next we're going to stitch the zipper in place. We're going to switch over to our zipper foot, and then we are going to stitch that in place. Now you can do this in 2 steps, but it is just a wee bit quicker doing it in the 1 step by sandwiching that zipper in between here. And once we have that done, we're going to take it over to our pressing mat and we're going to press it with the wrong sides together. And I like to press on the front, and then I like to flip it over and press it on the back, just so I make sure that I have a nice crisp press, because what we're going to do next is we are going to top stitch along this edge to make sure that it stays in place. So just along here, we are going to follow the crease just with the edge of our presser foot, and we're going to top stitch this in place. And it should look something like this. So now that that is done, we are going to grab the main body piece of our pouch, and we're going to place that right sides together with the zipper. So the zipper is face down, and then we're going to take the lining pocket of the pouch and we're going to place that on top, sandwiching it together just as we did in the step before that. So we're just going to pin that in place. And you can use clips if you prefer. I just like to use pins. And then we're going to stitch it the same as we did before. I also decided to stitch the end of the zipper tape because my zipper is a wee bit longer. The next thing, you're going to move your zipper tape inwards and you're going to pin the edge and stitch that in place to create that zipper stop. And then you're going to cut off the excess edges of the zipper. Now onto the English paper piecing of these little diamonds. So with this, I have fussy cut out of my fabric some diamond shapes. And what I am doing here, I'm using Steam 2. That's not what you want to use. You want to use the print, stitch, and dissolve because it's actually paper, and then when you wash it, the paper just dissolves away. I couldn't find it at first and ordered it, and it didn't come in time for me to do this. So you're seeing me do it with the Stitch-A-Seam. Now you could also do it with regular cardstock paper that you would for English paper piecing. Now this template, I will leave a link down below. It is very tiny, so those little pieces are a little tricky to do, and I find that when you use the dissolvable one, it just makes it easier because you can leave the paper in there. And what I like to do before I press my edges is I actually like to add Best Press, which is a starch alternative, so that I can starch those edges. So this is the same procedure, turning in the corners that you would whether you're using the paper or the dissolvable paper or this Stitch-A-Press. And so I'm just pressing them all, and then you can see that we've got a little tail coming out the end pointing in one direction. You want to make sure that those tails are all going in the same direction. Now you're going to leave the paper in there if you're using the 2 methods that you should be using. Because I'm using the Stitch-A-Press, it's actually got an adhesive on the one side, so it's perfect for applique, but not so great for English paper piecing. So I'm actually just pressing it together, and then I'm placing that paper piece back on the edge and giving it a press just to set that, which will set my corners in place. And so you're going to want to make a number of these, however many you want for your design. And so I've fussy cut out some of these, and then you're going to find a matching thread. Just a little side note here. This thread matches great with my two bold prints, but the lighter teal and the white, it does show up on, so I should have changed my thread. Don't forget to use a thimble. You can see my fingers got a little pinprick in it because I have poked myself. So I always like to wax my thread whenever I'm doing any hand stitching. So I just run it through the wax, and this just helps it to glide a lot better and to not tangle up. And then you're going to take the end that you've pulled off the spool, you're going to clip it so you've got a nice crisp edge. And then what I find works best is you hold it down in between your fingers, and then you push the needle towards your finger, and it lines up the needle perfectly every time. You want about a length from your fingertips to your elbow. Anything longer than that, and it's just too long to hand stitch with. And then you're going to tie a little knot on the end. My knots are always kind of big and bulky, so I tend to trim them down. I really should research on how to make a prettier knot because I know there are methods out there. And next we are going to hand stitch these together. So we're going to create the little heart out of the two diamond shapes. So we're going to place them right sides together. And then we are going to run a running stitch in just to kind of bury our knot. And then we are going to take a single stitch in, and you are barely going into the fabric here. And then you're going to take another single stitch, but don't pull it all the way through this time. You want to leave a little loop, which will be your knot, and that finishes the edge. Now you are going to do your stitches about 2 millimeters apart, so quite close together, and you want them to go in. So if you have the papers, you shouldn't be going through the paper. You should be going through just like the edges of the fabric, just little hairs of the fabric, or it's going to show through on the front. When you get to the edge, you're going to do a single stitch through the end, and then you're going to pull it through, and you will notice that there is another knot. Keep another loop because we want to knot it. You are always going to knot the start and the end every single time. This way, if you ever have to take anything out or something comes apart, it's not going to unravel everything. And now you've got your first little heart. So you're going to continue to create these hearts and joining them up in the pattern that you've selected. I've got a printable so that you can follow along if you wanted to follow along with this pattern as well. And I am just adding this in a combination of diamonds as well as little diamond shape triangle pieces that are going to form my heart design here. And so then in order to attach this one, what we're going to do is we're going to add a running stitch going from the end we had just finished and then up towards the top of where we're going to join that corner to the next piece. Now, because this is a light piece, I should have switched to a lighter thread because it does show through. So just something, if you're going to be using contrasting light and dark, you might want to switch your threads in between here. Unfortunately, I didn't, and I'm kicking myself for not doing it. And so next we're going to take a single stitch, and then we are going to go back in that double stitch and then leave the loop and pull our thread through the knot, securing that end. And then we're going to continue stitching all the way down the end here to attach our heart in place. And just keep on going those 2 millimeters apart. It is quite nice when you actually get going. It's nice and relaxing. And then the next one, you are just going to do that same running stitch over to the other side and then continue stitching, making sure you knot it at both the start and the end. And so as you can see, I'm starting to add in those triangle diamond shapes here. And I am attaching them in the exact same fashion that we attached the hearts. And I'm just going through, and this one 100% should have been white thread. I've got 2 light pieces here, so it's most certainly showing. But I'm going in, and at the point of that diamond piece, I am going to put it through, and then I am going to knot it. So you can see me going up and knotting it and going through. And once we have that knotted, then we're going to do the other side. So we're just going to manipulate the fabric and just twist it slightly so that we can get the rest of the diamond on. So I'm going to put one stitch through. I'm just going to loosen that up over the edge. And then when we do the second stitch in the exact same spot, we are going to leave that loop and we are going to knot it. So essentially you're going to have at every intersection, you're going to have 2 knots, one at the end of one stitching line and one at the beginning of the next stitching line, which really makes those corner and center conjectures really durable because you've got all of these back stitching and knots at that end. So you're just going to continue doing your heart motif. This is what mine looks like. And here I'm pointing out that you can see the stitches and I should have switched my thread. And I'm just giving it a nice good press. Now always remember, you never want to press anything if it's on the bias because it's going to stretch. This, because it's got that stabilizer in it and it's all stitched in place, we don't have to worry about. So next I am taking my needle case and I've actually marked the fold on where everything is going to fold up because this is very important as we're adding this as an applique to the front of the needle case. So once I've got it placed where I'd like it to go, I am using a glue base. So this is a permanent glue base and I'm just adding little dots of glue along here. And this will permanently hold it in place while I applique this on because if you pin it, it's going to shift around a little bit. This glue, it works fantastic when doing any applique piecing. And so once I've got that on, I'm going to take the iron and I'm going to give it a nice good press here. And then we are going to applique this on. So you're going to applique this by, I'm using invisible thread just because I've got dark and light colors here, but you can use like a color that complements what you're doing. So I'm just going in and I'm pulling the needle up through the main fabric and then just grabbing the corner bits of the fabric on the edge of my applique, and then I'm bringing it down only through the exterior fabric in the same hole that I went up in. And we're going to follow that same procedure going all the way up. Now when we get to these corners where we have these little flaps, what you're going to do is you're going to use your needle and you're just going to push it and tuck it in and continue to applique going down the sides just as we did before, going around. And then when you get to the point where it's kind of in that opposite direction, it can be a little bit troublesome to kind of push it through, but just make sure you just use your needle and your fingers to kind of roll that back and push it through where it needs to go. And then just continue to applique along the edge here. And don't forget to tie off your knots at the end of your applique so your applique doesn't fall off. And once that is all done, it'll look like this. And so we have the applique just on the inside. You don't want to do it on the pocket layer. Next is the heart applique. So I've got a separate heart applique and I'm also using best press on this as well. And I'm just putting it along the outside and I've got the stitches seam on this. Because it is an applique, you want to use the stitches seam, which is basically that adhesive that will glue it down for you. So I'm just pressing in all the corners of my heart and I made sure to clip the center so that I could really get it in there. Then I removed the paper backing and I am pressing down all of the sides. Now that being said, we've got a lot of little pieces and corners, so I'm just using my glue stick to baste those corners in place. And you can use an actual glue for quilting, but it is the exact same glue that's in the dollar store glue sticks. The dollar store glue sticks are just much chunkier, and so it makes it a little bit more messy. And then I'm pressing it just to set that glue. Don't forget to put the paper backing on the one side, otherwise you're going to glue it down to your ironing table. So next we are going to figure out how we're going to place these applique hearts on, and these are in a specific heart shape because I am giving this away as a gift and the individual doesn't like those big bubbly hearts but likes these kind of more geometric, long, curvy hearts. And so I've decided to do 3. I'm also going to use that glue basting just along the edges that don't have that sticky layer. And then I am just measuring to make sure that everything is on the equal side so that I can make sure that everything matches up nicely. And once we've got that down, then we are going to press it with our iron. and that will hold the back pieces, that is the stick-a-seam, as well as setting that glue that we had just put on. And then we can go ahead and we can applique this just as we appliqued the front of our needle case with the English paper pieced hearts. And just going in, going all the way around, and you don't have to tuck any ends on this one, which is nice because it's already done for you on the applique. And when it's all done, it should look something like this. I like to keep the seam pressed so that I know exactly where everything's going to fold. And I think I might put a button on the front of the pocket here. Now we're going to attach the magnetic closures. Now we're only going to attach one side right now. The other side comes later. So we're actually going to attach the bottom piece. So I'm just measuring right here, kind of where my flap comes, and I'm going to put a pin through where I want the magnet closure to go. So I'm just going to place the pin in, and then I'm going to get a water-soluble marker, or you could use a chalk pen, and just mark the center of that. The next thing we are going to do is we are going to stabilize the back of this. So just on the one side, we're going to add some medium to heavyweight interfacing to ensure that it is nice and stable so that your closure doesn't rip. Next, I have marked where the two holes are going to go for my clasp, so how far apart that clasp is, and I've just marked that with 2 lines. Then I'm just going to fold my fabric in half and grab a pair of snips and snip out just the smallest amount of fabric along here, just enough so that I can put my clasp through those holes. Once I've got that through, then I can measure exactly where it's going to go on the lining side. And we're going to stabilize the lining side as well. And we are going to clip it, and then it can go through on both ends. And then we can push that closed. Now this lining side is the lining of the pocket, so you're not going to see those metal prongs. So don't worry about that. That will get covered up with the actual cover of the inside of the book. Next is the inside needle case pockets. So we're going to start out with the larger pocket. So this is where all of the circular needles will go. And I am pinning along the 2 short ends. So the 2 longer ends we're going to leave open. They're going to get caught up in the binding, so we don't have to worry about that. So we're going to stitch those, and then on the smaller pocket, this is where the needles are going to go. We're going to place them right sides together, and along the 2 long edges, as opposed to the short edges, we are going to stitch going down because the top 2 are also going to get caught in the binding. So once it is all stitched together, we want to move this so that it is right side out, and then we are going to press the edges, and I'm just rolling the edges to make sure that none of the lining shows. And so now we are going to top stitch along each of those ends just to make it nice and neat. After it's top stitched, we're going to fold both of them in half, and we're going to fold them in half towards the area that has the finished seam, so not the raw edges. And this is going to mark our center line, which is also the line in which the needle case folds in on itself. So I'm just marking this and making sure that it is perfectly aligned. And then we are going to pin this in place. And once we have it pinned in place, now we can begin marking where we are going to put our needles going in, and you can really choose how you want to do this. You can also look to Erica's video tutorial where she talks about the actual widths on how much you should leave in between them, because you do want to vary them because you have different sized knitting needles. Some are very narrow and some are thicker. So just kind of varying that and looking at what you have in your case as well. And then we're going to draw that on both sides, and then we're going to draw a line down the center, and we're going to stitch all the way down, and don't forget to stitch down the center. So it should kind of go like this. You can see some of them are bigger and some of them are smaller. Next, this is the inside lining piece of the fabric, and then we're going to place the 2 pocket pieces on top of that. And I have put a needle minder in here, and I've cut this out of felt because I am always losing my needles. Even when I'm knitting, I use a knitting needle, and I like to have a needle minder with me. So I'm just going to zigzag all along the edges here. And now is when we're going to add the magnetic closures for the other side. So we're going to reinforce this. So we're going to add that heavyweight fusible interfacing on the side. And just as we did before, we're going to mark our holes, and we're going to snip those holes so that we can add our clasp. So we're going to add the clasp. And this is the male clasp. On the first clasp is the female clasp. I guess it doesn't really matter, but I always like to have the male clasp on the inside here. And now we are just going to sandwich everything together and line it up. So this is the lining for the pocket. So this is the back side of the pocket that you're going to see. So you want to make sure that that's the same as what your pocket lining is. Next, I've got a layer of quilt batting, and I like to use 100% cotton. And then we've got a layer of our exterior lining piece, and then our needlebook cover piece. Now I am just measuring from the one edge where it's supposed to go. That being said, because I've added the clasp as well as my applique details, I realized that I was lining it up on the wrong side. So I'm actually just going over and figuring it out on this side. Actually, if I measured it on the opposite side where my needle minder is, it probably would have been exactly where it needed to be. But I'm just being a little particular because I want to make sure that this lines up right down the center so that you don't have difficulties closing it if it is slightly off. So I'm marking that with pins, and then I'm placing the center of the book, the needle case, right in here. And then I am going to pin this in place. And that seems to work perfectly. So I'm just going to pin it in place, and then I am going to baste along all of the outside edges because we want to make sure that everything is sandwiched in there nicely before we go on to the next step. So I'm just going to pin these in place, including all of the corners because we do have those sandwiched layers in there, and stitch all the way around. So it should look something like this. I'm just taking my quilting ruler and my rotary cutter, and I am truing up all of this and squaring it up to make sure everything is neat and perfect, because that really affects how your binding lays if you don't square everything up after. And I'm just clipping some extra threads here. So it will look just like this, and now we can go on to the binding. So with our binding, we're going to take 2-inch strips, and we're just going to stitch them straight down the edges. So you don't need to do the diagonal on this because it is such a small project. It doesn't make a big deal. On a quilt, 100% I'm going to do a diagonal join, but on a small book like this needle case, it doesn't need to be. Then we're going to fold the binding in half with wrong sides together, just as you would do for any regular quilt binding. And then we are going to attach our binding. So you're going to start somewhere in the middle on a long edge and leave a nice good tail at the start. So you see I'm starting in the middle and I've got a decent tail starting, and you're going to backstitch at the start. And then as we go down to the corner, you're going to place your needle down, and then you're going to backstitch away at about 1/4 inch away from the edge, which is the amount that our seam allowance is. Next, we are going to fold that binding directly up, so forming that nice miter in the corner, and then we're going to fold it right back down on itself. Now, this is what creates that perfect mitered corner when you're doing your quilt binding. And once you have that in place, it can be a little fiddly at first, especially when you've got long tails. Then you're going to place your needle down 1/4 inch away from the edge, which is right where you stopped your stitching, and start stitching. And let's see that one more time. So we're just going to backstitch off. So you don't want to backstitch directly back on your same stitching because you don't want it to be slightly off with that seam allowance, because sometimes when you go backwards, it's not exact. Hence the reason we're backing off at an angle out to the raw edges. We're going to flip it up and then back down again, and then place that needle in at that 1/4 inch and begin stitching. And I do a little back stitch at the front and back technically you don't need to do it, but I always worry that I am going to lose that. So next, you're going to leave a area that's open with those two long tails, and I've just marked randomly a spot in the middle, and this is where we're going to join it. So I'm actually marking on my fabric here where the two are supposed to join, and then I'm going to take my quilting ruler and I'm going to mark off the 1/4 inch seam allowance that I'm going to be stitching at, and I'm just going to cut it because it is straight. This would be done slightly different if we were doing the mitered seams where they're going in at an angle. And once you have that, then you're just going to place them right sides together. And then you're going to pop over to the sewing machine and you're just going to stitch that in place. So here we are at the sewing machine. Now you could have left longer tails than I did and it would make it a little bit easier. It's kind of fiddly here because I didn't leave as much room, but I kind of like it that way. And once that is done, then I am just making sure that I'm opening up the seam as if I were pressing it. You could take it to the iron and press it if you like, but I usually just stitch it on here right at the machine. And this is where you're going to continue attaching the binding absolutely perfectly and seamlessly. So now that you have the binding on attached to the front, then we're going to flip that binding over and we're going to attach it to the back. So I'm using some quilting clips, and I am just attaching that binding on. So I thought I would talk a little bit about how I do the mitered corners. So you just push it in under one side and then push the other side over, and it gives a perfect miter on both sides. So you're going to continue clipping this all along the perimeter of your needle case. And you have two options. The first option, you can take it back to your sewing machine and you can sew all the way around, or the option that I personally prefer, you can hand sew it. Hand sewn binding, in my opinion, always looks much nicer and much more professional. Plus, it gives it a nice little fluffy look to it. And what you're going to do is you're going to do a ladder stitch to stitch that on. I'll leave a link to a tutorial on how to do that in a bit more depth if you want some instruction on that. And now your needle case is all done and ready to place your knitting needles into.
So now that we have our needle case all done and ready to use, you can pop in those circular needles in there and store them nicely. Mine is currently stored in Ziploc bags, so this one is actually going out as a gift, but I think I am going to make my own needle case to store my circular needles. And are there any other sewists out there that also knit? Do let me know in the description down below. And would you be interested in seeing some knitting tutorials as well? I'd love to know. Until next time, makers, let's get our sewspiration on.